Hi, it's Frank. Once again, I'm talking about inversions, and specifically we're going to be looking at minor and diminished chord inversions as we move up two different sets of strings. The first, second, and third string, and the second, third, and fourth string. This is similar to what I did in the previous video, the one just before this, where I talked about major chords. Since we're dealing with minor and diminished, we're only going to have small variations in what you already saw in terms of what we're playing in the notes. The locations are going to be more or less the same, though. That is to say, where we're starting each of these. Just to help with visualizing, there's a link to a PDF in the description. Feel free to click on that to go ahead and get a PDF version of this that you can look at either during or after the video. So for minor, not surprisingly, of course, as we've already discussed previously, we're just going to alter one note from major. So since we had a C major chord in the last video, beginning with the 5th fret of strings 3 and 2, and then the 3rd fret of string 1, this was our root position C chord. All we're going to do for minor is lower that E by a half step. Recall that in root position, the 3rd is the note between your 3rd finger and 1st finger. So that means instead of the 5th fret, we want the 4th fret. So our minor chord shape, first one to memorize, looks like that across the first 3 strings. This is the root position. As we move up the neck, we previously located E at the 9th fret of the 3rd string. This is what gave us the C major triad in first inversion. Turns out, since we just have to drop that one note, the next inversion is pretty easy. It looks like that. It's 3 strings, the first 3 strings at the 8th fret, barred with 1 finger. That's most likely the easiest way to play this. You could try and pack a bunch of fingers in there like we do for A chords way down in first position, but I would urge you to try and use the bar shape. It'll serve you much better as we continue to explore positions further up the neck. So once again, first inversion means we've got E flat G with C, the root, on top on the first string. From here, the last inversion, second inversion, puts the 5th on the bottom. That's G. As previously mentioned, the G happens to be the 12th fret of the 3rd string, So this shape here then will consist of the 12th fret of the 3rd string, 13th fret of the 2nd string, 11th fret of the 1st string. There we have a C minor chord in second inversion. This shape actually is the same shape as D as in dog in first position, if you're familiar with that chord. As I've mentioned in some of my earlier videos, this is simply a D as in dog minor chord in first inversion. So once again, to recap, there, bar shape here on the 8th fret, and then beginning with the low note on the 12th fret of the 3rd string. Now from here, I'm going to go right to diminished before we change string sets. And the reason for that is if you think back to when we first learned about diminished chords in some of my earlier videos, I talked about how it's essentially a minor chord with one note that's altered, and that's because it's built from the same interval from one note to the next and then from there to the 3rd note, unlike major and minor triads. The idea is that all we have to do is take the 5th note, in this case the 5th of the triad, and lower it by a half step, flat it as we say. So if we think back to what I just did here, where I was 5, 4, and 3, that means I want to use the 2nd fret of the 1st string. This is a bit of a stretch. If you're not comfortable with that yet, try replacing the low notes with pinky and ring finger, and then playing from 5th fret of the 3rd string to 4th fret of the 2nd string to 2nd fret of the 1st string. That gives me C diminished. Once again, this is root position because C is on the bottom. As we move up the neck, recall this was C minor in first inversion. All I need to do is take that note, which is the 5th, G, and drop it by a half step. If you think back to when we discussed how first inversion works, the middle note is the 5th. So that means I need to take this G note and lower it by a half step, 1 fret. That gives me a shape which looks a lot like a first position D as in dog 7 chord. Turns out it's exactly the same kind of note, chord rather, but when I leave out the open string, it's a diminished chord. So when you play down here, you're actually playing a diminished chord. Up here, it's still diminished, of course. Specifically, though, it's identifiable by the fact that the 3rd is on the bottom, and that 3rd note is E flat. So that's first inversion, C diminished chord. From here, to get up to the last diminished chord that we're using on this string set, I'm going to go to the G, which was the low note for the C minor in second inversion, and I'm going to lower that to a G flat like that. Now I'm playing this as a bar shape, covering the 11th fret of the first 3 strings, adding my ring finger to the 13th fret of the 2nd string. If you wanted to, you could play it with 3 individual fingers. but I tend to favor using the bar shape whenever I can. It tends to be a little bit easier as I move around the neck. It helps me remember my position more readily. So once again, we have C minor down here, which when I lower the fifth of the chord becomes C diminished. C minor right here on the 8th fret, which when I lower the fifth here, looks like a D as in dog 7 shape. And then C minor up here, which when I lower the fifth, now includes 2 notes on the 11th fret and 1 on the 13th. From there, we're going to look at string sets 2, 3, and 4. String set rather, 2, 3, and 4. And for this, we're just simply going to go ahead and start with our C major chord from the last video. Recall that was where we had the 10th fret of the 4th string. And we're just going to lower the 3rd. And that's going to give us a shape that looks like that. 10, 8, 8 across strings 4, 3, and 2. So once again, using a small bar shape there to help with that. Now from here, to make this diminished, I know the 5th is on top, so I'm just going to lower that by a half step. That does require me to change my fingering, excuse me, so that now I can play like that. 10th fret, 8th fret, 7th fret. So that went from minor to diminished by simply lowering the top note, in this case the note on the 2nd string. So for my neck shape, I'm going to go ahead and play C minor here in first inversion. Once again, this is strings 4, 3, and 2. And I'm using the 13th fret of strings 4 and 2 with the 12th fret. That's the G of string 3. That's first inversion. Here, as I did in the previous video, I'm going to drop down an octave because it becomes a little unwieldy to move that far up the neck on this acoustic. Here, for the second inversion, I've got my G note on the bottom. And I've got C above that with an E flat right there. Now the diminished chord that I could go ahead and play from this position up here, I should mention, can go ahead and be played by simply lowering the note that's on the 12th fret, which is the G, the 5th of the chord, by a half step. So I once again get E flat, G flat, and then C on top. And then down here, C minor chord that is now the second inversion. I know that the G is the low note in second inversion, so lowering that a half step gives me 4th fret of strings 4 and 2 with the 5th fret of string 3. Here again, you could employ a bar if you like. That's always an option. All right, so those are the minor and diminished chords across this string set. Let's recap those in relation to one another. Root position minor was here. For diminished, I lowered the 5th G, which was on the 2nd string. First inversion minor was here. For diminished, I lowered the note on the 3rd string, just by a half step as a reminder. And then the second inversion minor was right here. And the root is the note I want to lower, so I just drop that by a half step. Now I've got second inversion C diminished. All right? So these are all shapes worth looking at least once or twice just to get familiar with them, because they wind up happening in all kinds of songs. That is to say, sometimes instead of using a root position chord, someone uses an inversion because it makes moving from one chord to the next a little smoother, whether you're strumming or in many cases if you're creating chord melody arrangements, which is something we'll delve into a little bit more in later videos. Once again, these are shapes though that are worth exploring because they, if nothing else, they open up all kinds of new territory on the neck of the guitar. All right, take care.